Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. The General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is a regulation by which the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Commission intend to strengthen and unify data protection for all individuals within the European Union. It also addresses the export of personal data outside the EU. The GDPR aims primarily to give control back to citizens of the EU over their personal data and to simplify the regulatory environment for international business by unifying the regulation within the EU. There are two drivers behind the GDPR. First, the EU wants to give people more control over how their personal data is used, bearing in mind that many companies access to people's data for use of their services. The current legislation, DPD, was enacted in 1995, so before the internet and cloud technology created new ways of exploring data. And the GDPR seeks to address that by strengthening data protection legislation and introducing tougher enforcement measures. The EU hopes to improve trust in the emerging digital economy. Second, the EU wants to give businesses a simpler, clearer legal environment in which to operate, making data protection identical throughout the single market. The GDPR regulation is complex to understand and fact-specific, meaning each organization's GDPR program may mean something different from the next company's. Many businesses also realize today that the GDPR affects everyone, not just IT, and many organizations appear stuck in analysis paralysis, incapable of implementing simple and efficient strategies to meet the GDPR challenge. My name is Serge Rob, Regional Product Marketing Director at Veeam Software, and I am your host for the VeeamLive Show on GDPR today. We have a great panel of experts with me who will share precious tips on what their company learned through their own compliance to help accelerate your GDPR efforts. Christopher Scott, who is Data Protection Officer, Board Level Director at the Bunker in England. Leonard Uwerkerk, IT and Privacy Lawyer at Intermax Cloud Sourcing in Rotterdam, Holland. And Mark Wong, General Counsel, Corporate Management at Veeam Software and based in the USA. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Okay, super. Ready for the show?
Yeah,
okay, super. So, GDPR is coming soon. As you know, the exact date is May 25th this year. And enterprises everywhere are in the middle of figuring what kind of implications they will face with this GDPR thing. So, in terms of the EU legislation, we have a regulation, we have a directive. So what does that mean? What makes them different? So what are the differences between the two, regulation versus directive? Who wants to answer first?
Yeah, I can take that for you, sir.
Yeah.
So if we start with the directive, so this was born in 1995, and a directive under EU law is just a set of objectives. And what happens there is then each member state has to apply their own sort of legislation. So we're now in this situation where we have 28 different member states, all with different data protection laws. So the challenges there is around that free movement of data. Also the inconsistencies in how we're applying data, security around that data. A regulation is slightly different in that it is legislation effectively. So 28 member states are all aligned in terms of one law, which is great for, you know, in terms of global entities now dealing business within the EU, that they now can sort of move that data around. And I think in 2012, the EU Commission, Parliament and Council decided there needed to be a better approach. You know, the directive is 22 years old. The way we handle security sort of today is vastly different to what we did 22 years ago.
Absolutely.
The systems that we use, you know, we're using cloud, we're using various different encryption sort of mechanisms, etc. So the regulation has to talk to that. But the second objective was around that free movement of data. Now, as a global entity now, under a regulation, you'll be able to freely move that data around. But this has been extended further to the EEA. So on the EU Commission's website, you can see all the countries that have what's known as adequacy agreements in place. And that enables us now, not just within the EU, but in the extended economic or the economic area. If we have some broader thinking, and it'd be interesting to see you guys' thoughts on this, but if we get countries like the States, you know, India, etc., to sort of have their own adequacy agreements to bring into alignment with GDPR, potentially we can achieve, you know, a globally recognised data protection standard, which would all benefit the data subjects and help with that freedom movement, which I see as a great opportunity. Yeah.
I agree. I think international companies such as Veeam that have a global footprint face this challenge where each country that we deal with has slightly different data privacy laws, right? And GDPR, what it did is it effectively centralized it for Europe and, as you said, the extended economic area. But also, if we adopt it in the United States and other countries that we do business, we find it's easier to move the EU data out and really effectively operate as an international company. Yeah. I think one more distinction I would add is that the difference between the legislation and the directive is that the legislation has penalties behind it, right? And enforcement, an enforcement kind of hammer, where the legislators can come or the policy administrators can come by and actually lever penalties if you don't actually perform adequate best practices towards data protection. And I think that's a key difference that has everyone's attention compared to the 95 directive.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically it works like a decree. So whether member states like it or not, it just comes. It's like a train. You cannot stop it.
Boom.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
You have
It's
to.
there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you can discuss about it what you want, but at the end it will be there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as the UK is leaving the EU, so what will happen in the UK with the UK businesses and the GDPR? I think the question is for you, Chris.
Yeah, no,
That's interesting to know, because for us it's a bit of a black box right now. So
so the regulation's quite clear. Any entity dealing business with EU citizens' data is bound by the General Data Protection Regulation. We have the Data Protection Bill going through its third iteration in Parliament at the moment, and it would make no business sense for that not to be aligned with GDPR, because I think, you know, if you see what GDPR is attempting to achieve from a data protection sort of standard, you know, that this is what we need to sort of embrace as businesses. You know, it's sensible business.
to keep a level playing field.
Absolutely. So I should imagine it'd have no impact on us. We would seek for those adequacy agreements. We would be in the EEA. So I think moving forward, I think we leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019. But from, you know, our data protection bill, I don't see anything changing in terms of our compliance with GDPR.
I agree. GDPR effectively becomes the gold standard, I think, globally.
Yeah.
And that it is the first broad sweeping directive that goes into so much detail about how you should handle and protect data. And I think you're just going to find that more and more countries, even outside of the EU, I've even seen it in Turkey and Asia, that countries are now implementing very much GDPR-like initiatives within their countries and their data privacy laws. So I would see GDPR as a gold standard. And if companies like Veeam or the Bunker and all of our customers and partners abide by the GDPR, they're going to be in pretty good shape, I think, from a global data privacy protection perspective.
I agree.
But what opportunities are presented by GDPR to businesses then?
I think that's a challenging and loaded question, right? Because some companies will argue that they have the solution for GDPR, but I think it's very indicative that we have three different experts here, and from three different aspects of our partnership, right? There's no single solution to GDPR. I think a company out there has to understand and know their data first, but then understand their partners, their vendors, and their solutions providers all comprehensively together fit your GDPR solution, right? There's opportunities for all of us to enhance our kind of value to the market. You know, Veeam being the leader and backup adds that value. But I think, you know, I'll hand it off to Chris. From his perspective in the bunker, I think they have value propositions that are highlighted by GDPR and enhanced by GDPR.
You know, absolutely, Mark. So what we've seen, so we've been in the opportunity, because we host data in ex-military nuclear bunkers. So we've been working with businesses that govern risk and compliance. So they've been sort of ahead of the game in terms of GDPR. And although it has been a challenge, which I think we all agree, you know, rolling it out to our businesses has been tough. But we've seen three key areas of opportunity. And you're right in what you're saying. You have to be mindful of any company saying, here's my GDPR stamp of compliance, you know, I comply. But as you're applying it to yourself, you will understand those opportunities. And what we've seen is threefold. Firstly, you start off with, so we're regulated by the ICO, the Information Commission's Office. That's our statutory authority. They've got a 12-step plan. The second step is, where is my data? So what you do is go through a data mapping exercise.
Absolutely.
And you're doing a risk assessment against the Article 5, the principles of GDPR, against that data. So you're challenging your business. You're saying, why do I have this data? How long do I have this data? Is it fair, transparent, etc.? What you end up doing is boiling that data down, looking at the data with different lenses. Do I need that data? And then what you end up doing is having these operational efficiencies, these business processes.
Yep.
So business operational efficiencies are a way of increasing or maintaining margin without increasing operational costs.
Correct.
So that's step one. Or step two in the ICO 12-step guide, will reduce your costs as a business, give you a stable, compliant platform for growth. The second is found in Article 28. So Article 28, paragraph 1, states that the data controller must provide sufficient guarantees that the processor can process information on their behalf. Simply put, that's supply chain management. So the data controller has to do their due diligence. Yep. But what's the opportunity? So me as a business, as a processor now, if I can demonstrate compliance, if I can demonstrate I'm doing things right, you know, and again, there's no stamp to do this, but if you can do that, there's, you know, you will win business. Yep. And thirdly, I think, you know, as experts in the room, you know, we've all done this to our own product and services catalogue. So as controllers and processors, you know, what over the years we've built methodologies, applications, etc., all to look after data subjects' data.
Correct.
Now, by assessing that and productizing that, you not only retain business, but you're also getting new business and growing your business via what you do naturally. So, you
Correct.
know. I'm sure you've seen that yourself, guys.
And I think on top of that, it's an enhancement to the reputation of your business, ultimately, yes. Right? And that if you care about data privacy and you protect it, especially in the industries that we're in, that's paramount to our reputations to be able to deliver products, you know, that help our customers and partners with that solution. But we ourselves also have to believe in that ourselves and do it ourselves, right?
Yeah, no,
and I think the reputational ad is the big business opportunity, and that your customers can now feel confident that you care. You've taken the investment, right, to protect their information, and I think that goes a long way towards establishing more business opportunities by enhancing that reputation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a very loaded question. It was mentioned here because the thing is, everyone did a search on Google GDPR, and
sure.
you saw a lot of hits coming up.
Sure.
A lot of companies claim that they can help you with A to Z GDPR compliancy. And my advice to those companies that search on Google for those type of solutions is be critical and start with yourself. The data mapping was already mentioned. First, map your data, know which business process you have, see what data you have, and then see which sort of vendors fit the bill at the end. That would be my advice. And yeah, business opportunities, plenty. I also I also make money out of the GDPR. So at the end, there are business opportunities for everyone, but make sure that you make the right decisions.
Agreed.
Yeah, superb, superb. Well, there are still myths with about the GDPR. So on my side, sometimes I hear things like all personal data is the same.
Yeah.
As an example.
Yeah, there are many myths when it comes to GDPR.
Yeah, another one is GDPR does not apply to data already collected. So what is your advice? What is your tip, Mark?
I think unfortunately that's wrong. You know, just like the myth that we just dispelled, which is there's a one-stop solution that can solve your GDPR problems, right? GDPR is not just a forward-looking legislation. It basically examines your business process, the data that you already have, how you've collected in the past. So you have to address your data that you already have, your processes that you already have, and optimize them going forward to ensure that you are GDPR compliant. So anything that you have today, you have to make sure that it was collected in a GDPR compliant way, and if not, you have to go back there and double back and ensure that you did do it the right way. Believing into the myths is very dangerous territory, and I think, you know, going back to what Leonard said, is that you need to know your data first, right? That's the first step to compliance, is tackling that big issue, knowing your data before you can even manage it, right? And then you have to design your processes and improvements forward, looking from there, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I've seen a lot of these myths. You know, I work with a number of customers, and I think you, in your intro, you used a good key saying, paralysis by analysis.
Yes.
You know, and that's where we are as businesses. Certainly the businesses I look at today, they still aren't pushing forward. And the reason why is they're told, if you get it wrong, here's the effective, dissuasive, proportionate fines.
Correct.
And it's the stick all the time. But let's not forget, everyone in this room's a data subject.
Sure.
You know, we all have data. We have mortgages, healthcare, etc. And all we want to do is hand that information to a data controller. All we ask for in return is products and services to make our life easier. But you keep that data safe.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the regulation coming along now, you know, addresses some of the pinch points we had in the Data Protection Directive. But I think the market's perception is us as data subjects, you know, come 25th of May, we're going to get these godlike rights.
Yeah.
You know, we're all of a sudden going to say, OK, let's see all the information you have on me. You know, I want to invoke my right to be forgotten, object, restrict processing, all of this stuff. When really, as data subjects, all we care about is, OK, I'll give you my information. You know, I want those products and services. Please keep it safe. And that's all I have no, I don't know about you guys, but I have no interest on the 25th of May of giving the processor controller a hard time. I assume they're doing their job.
Yeah.
But I think the regulation's a good thing by those fines, it's holding people accountable. In Article 5, the principles, we call it the 6+1 principles, and the +1 is accountability.
Yep.
So accountabilities are on the controller as much as they are on the processor, which I think is a good thing, because certainly for us in the Data Protection Act, everything went back to the controller. Correct. And it's hard for the controller to penalise the processor unless it was contractual, etc. Liabilities are directly placed
By identifications or such. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, businesses need to remember that the directive is, the legislation, is out there to help protect data subjects' interests, but it doesn't stop how we do business, right?
No.
It tries to improve how we do business, because ultimately they're putting the responsibility on data controllers and processors that can benefit off using this data to have a higher level of responsibility and due care towards protecting the information, right? And ultimately, I think a takeaway principle for GDPR in general is protect the data. You have a responsibility to it because you're leveraging it for your business purposes, right?
Yeah,
so please protect it. The penalties, all that stuff, I think it's built in there to add a little bit of substance to this, but ultimately you have to put your best foot forward and your best effort forward. So take that first step, right, towards compliance. If you don't take it, that's where the penalty comes in.
Exactly.
If you take it and you do the best of your abilities, you start lowering the risk of that penalty. So taking those steps about knowing your data, managing your data, and protecting your data is critically important. You have to take that step.
Yeah.
I think that's excellent.
Otherwise,
advice,
you don't
yeah.
use it.
Yeah.
Don't use the
yeah.
data.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I mean, if I was an auditor going in, and it'd be a very different picture for someone not doing anything
Correct.
to someone that's tried.
Correct.
You know, you're not going to penalise someone who's done their data mapping, done a risk assessment.
Yep.
You're not going to get their everything in place by 25th of May.
Correct.
You know, some of the major banks, have got some big problems around legacy applications,
Absolutely.
around non-automated means, the paperwork, etc.
Yep.
What do they do with that? But if you've got that roadmap in place, if you're reducing the risk areas you just said, you'll take a very different view as to someone that's just said, I'm not doing anything.
Yeah, right.
Correct.
The thing is, if you start, you also forget about the myths. The thing is, if you actually start with the GDPR and you take notice of what the GDPR actually states, you suddenly realize, yeah, of course, there are a lot of things in GDPR which might be conflicting, or you might have the feeling that it looks like a cosmos on itself. The further you look, the more stars you see. That's correct. But the moment you start, the moment you forget about all those myths, or seeing that those myths can be debunked.
And I think to highlight another point is May 25th is the effective date, right? The law's been around for a while, and this was the grace period.
It's actually already in effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've just been all given a grace period in order to, get compliant. But then also on the compliance date, there aren't regulatory officials that are going to come out and hammer you, right, and spot you with an audit.
Yeah.
It's pressure to get companies to start thinking about it, but then you're not done when you get to May 25th. You have to keep going, right, because the data changes, right, the environment changes, the threats to your data also changes. And one of the theories and principles behind GDPR is continuous improvement. So they don't wait from 1995 until 2016 to rewrite the law when the technology between that time has changed so much. The GDPR does push us as the people that process data more often to start driving compliance towards responding to the risks that are evolving and changing and coming to us every day.
Absolutely.
So May 25th is just a date on the calendar, right? And how much you get done, hopefully it's as much as you possibly can. But May 26th, you still have the same responsibility, right? And going forward, I think you still have to keep this at the front of your mind.
You're right about it, because basically GDPR is also codification of things we already knew by now. So
or was recommended and we already thought about since 1995.
Exactly.
I mean, almost every company has opt-out, opt-in. But how are you focusing on that? Are you really testing your systems to make sure your opt-out works, right?
Yeah.
Or your opt-in works, right? Or do you just have it for show at the bottom of your email, right? GDPR puts the responsibility on yourself as a company to audit that, right?
Yeah.
Test that process out. Make sure that it works. And if it doesn't work, fix it. That's what GDPR wants you to do. Fix it and make it better, as opposed to just do it and leave it alone. So May 25th, just a date, right?
Yeah.
In our calendars, because we still need to continue thinking about this as the threats, as the data changes, and as our use case changes, right? Because GDPR also talks about legitimate use of the data, right? Your business evolves, and so you need to adjust your processes, and you might be able to tackle more data. Setting the foundation up right now will help you expand your business and be agile to grow when your business model might change. You might have a different route to market, and you have different types of data from your data subjects now. Having these processes and controls will enable your business to pivot if it needs to pivot, right?
Yeah.
And so now's the time to think about it, because if you don't think about it now, it's going to hit you very, very quickly, right?
No, absolutely.
So dig deeper than what the myths tell you, in fact.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And get your organization involved. I mean, at Veeam, I can tell you we have at least 5 representatives from every single business unit in multiple geographies. I myself, I'm based in the United States, but I am championing the GDPR initiative within the company because it is a company-wide issue. And so our entire executive team and every single business unit has at least 5 members participating in our weekly calls to talk about how is our business evolving, are we handling data the right way, and where do we need to improve? We talk about it on a weekly basis, on a daily basis.
Yeah, talking about the myths, and you mentioned the date.
Yeah.
And one of the myths I heard is, GDPR is going to be like the millennium bug. Have you heard this one? That is going to be a bit of a damp squid. And the argument, but if you think about it, you know, the Millennium Bug had a result. Either it was going to happen or it wasn't going to happen,
Correct.
right? You know, but GDPR is enforceable come 25th of May.
Yes.
That's when it starts. You know, so that's when if you breach, if you've got anything that you're not complying with, that's when you can get for it. And don't forget, the data subject can initiate that sort of line
Correct.
of questioning via a data subject access request.
Correct.
You know, and that's where we come. But that always sort of makes me chuckle, that particular myth.
You're not going to pass a date and then this is no longer a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
It's actually
exactly.
only going to become a bigger focal point for
Yeah,
you
yeah.
after this date.
Actually,
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
start of it all.
It
Basically.
is.
It is the start.
It's
It
not.
is.
It's not a sort of. You cannot sit back and relax and say, okay,
Yeah.
we're
Never.
done with the GDPR.
Yeah.
Never,
It's a
ever
release
with
date.
GDPR.
Yeah. We've had the preamble for 2 years.
Sure.
Then it's the date. Yeah.
So GDPR introduced a new role, DPO, or Data Protection Officer. So between Article 37 and Article 39, if
That's
I am
right,
correct.
yeah.
So what characteristics should businesses look for when they hire DPO? So
Yeah, we touched upon this earlier, actually. So you have to be mindful whether you need a DPO, because the regulation's very clear. When you appoint a DPO, you know, as you say, Articles 37 to 39, what that DPO is responsible for. You can't influence them. They have to act as an individual. You know, they have the 5 key tasks
Yes.
that they need to carry out.
Absolutely.
So my advice to anyone in terms of their business is do you need to appoint a DPO? In Article 37, there's 3 key areas. So whether it's a public body, you're processing information via a public body, you're systematically monitoring behaviours, or you're processing special category information. But here's the
it's very vague.
it's vague because
large scale also.
This is a large
Yeah.
scale.
What is that?
You know, because that's quite subjective, isn't it? I mean, there used to be iterations of the regulation where it said 250 personnel, but that's gone, and it's large scale. So, so I think a lot of businesses at the moment going, well, do I need one? You know, when do I appoint one? But also the regulation allows scope for. I've seen these services for virtual DPOs. I don't know if you've seen these yourselves.
Yeah, DPOs on demand. Or,
Yeah, exactly. So a subscription-based sort of DPO, which I think a lot of businesses are favouring because that sort of helps them with their compliance. They can pick up the phone, you know, and they're mandated to look after those 5 key tasks outlined in Article 39.
Virtual DPO.
Virtual DPO or DPO on demand, as we're seeing in the industry.
But I would say don't rely on that as a crutch. Ultimately, regardless of whether or not you appoint a DPO or not, the most important thing that an organization needs to do is understand that someone in the organization, whatever their title, has to be responsible for this,
Yes.
right? They have to champion this. They have to take the responsibility to walk the company through the analysis, the data mapping, the process analysis, the analysis of the software applications that you have that touch your data, where you store your data, right? The whole entire, what I call the data ecosystem, the personal information ecosystem. Someone needs to know that and map that out for the company first. So even if you rely on a outsourced DPO, that DPO is only going to ask you to provide the information to address those 5 principles, right?
No, you're right.
So it's almost what you feed that person has to be, you have to know what you're feeding them. That service will not replace the obligation of a company to identify their data, know their data, manage it, protect it, map it out, and identify those risks, right?
Absolutely right.
And so I think the key, regardless of whatever title you want to call it, you have to have someone inside the company that eats, lives, and breathes this and understands down to the last aspect of, are workstations locked, or do you have encryption on your workstations or your laptops that are out there? What do you do? Do you have a policy on how you handle cell phones that have push email, right?
Yeah.
Someone needs to have that responsibility, and ultimately the DPO ends up being the person that is handling the 5 principles set in addressing those 5 principles. But the company itself is responsible for ensuring that they actually know what they have, know what they want to do with it, and know what they need to do with it going forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big mistakes and where these myths are coming from is sort of organisations are going, well, we need a DPO.
Yeah.
So who we got? We got Sue from Accounts. Let's
Sure.
make her a DPO.
Yeah.
And then Sue from Accounts goes on to a course, 2-day course or
Yeah.
something. And then she's coming back and saying, we've got to get rid of all post. You know, we've
Correct.
got to do. So there's a little bit of knowledge. So you've got to be very careful who you appoint, don't you?
Absolutely.
You know, otherwise your business can't move forward. You've got someone sitting there saying, no, you can't do this. You've got product managers sort of wanting to press instant market products, and they simply can't because, you know, someone's sitting there sort of saying, well, you can't do that because my interpretation of the regulation is this, this, and this. But I think your point where, you know, have that key compliance sort of regime and a person to look after that, you know, that is a great strategy for most businesses.
And I think also get your executive management, your shareholders, whatever type company you might be, to buy into this, right? What we did at Veeam is we made sure that every single employee at Veeam understood the importance of this and started thinking about this, right? We had a lot of internal messaging about think about GDPR, think about data privacy, think about how you're doing things on a daily basis, right? And at every opportunity that we had, we talked about GDPR to the organization over the last 12 to 18 months, right? And what that generates is awareness. And awareness amongst your employees is a critical step because those employees are the ones that are touching this data, transacting with this data, right? And you want to have an open door type environment. The most important thing is to understand what you're doing. Not if it's wrong, or someone should not be apprehensive about saying, hey, I use Excel spreadsheets to transfer personal information. Let's talk about it. Bring it to the forefront. Let's talk about it. How do we fix it? How do we address it? That's more important. So I think choosing the right person at the top is critically important, but getting company-wide buy-in that this is important, that we need to understand what we're doing today as an organization is equally important to get that transparency, the visibility into your personal information ecosystem, right? To understand where the data comes in, where it moves, where does it go, where is it backed up. You need your employees to be open about that, to talk about it might not be the best way we do things today, but we need to talk about it so that we can fix it, right? You don't want employees to start saying, well, I'm a little embarrassed that we do things that way. I'm not going to tell them about that, right? Those are your critical pitfalls down the road. So, you know, visibility at the top, buy-in from your entire organization. This is a company-wide initiative. You have to involve everyone. It can't be just one person or outsourced person. If you do that, you will fail, right? You will fail if you do it that way.
Absolutely,
So. No, it's such a key point that you know, GDPR isn't just for the IT room.
Oh, no.
It's a business-wide, and it should be top-down. I mean, where they've placed the DPO needs to have the you know, report directly in to the highest level of management, because they need to be able to, you know, say, listen, I'm worried. You know, and funny what you said about people being embarrassed. So that first thing about data mapping. Every time I speak to organisations, you know, they're kind of, well, you know, we do things on spreadsheets, we email this, and they're really embarrassed, and they don't want their bosses to find out. You know, but we've all been guilty of it in the past.
Absolutely.
You know, we overuse email, we overuse spreadsheets.
Absolutely right.
We now need to, you know, have a paradigm shift in our thinking in terms of how we can sort of relay the same information but differently in a secure way. You know, and I think that's a challenge for a lot of businesses, and it can be achieved by technology and process and that governance and compliance kind of structure in place.
I want to add one thing to appointing a DPO because, like you said, Chris, you have to be very careful who you're going to appoint in the organization. And why is that also? That has to do with the fact that you have to take in consideration that if a DPO does his actual work well, you cannot fire the person itself. So here's the thing. So you hire someone or you hire a service from outside. And at a certain point, that person or that organization or the company that you hired wants to do notification to an authority about a breach of security. You cannot say, I don't want that. Or you cannot say, let's fire this person or this company. Basically, you have to do you have to have that person do its work well, so you cannot fire the person. So be careful who you appoint or which service you're actually gonna use.
Yeah, you can't fire and you can't influence.
Exactly.
You know, so that is.
So you have to trust that they have your company's best interests and you're aligned, and which means interviewing. Don't make that your choice and own that responsibility yourself. put that to your shareholders, your executive management team, right? That has to understand those restrictions, right?
Yeah,
and let them choose it. Don't let them say, hey, just go get the outsourced service if you like them.
Yeah.
Because when they come with the answer that you don't like when it comes to compliance time and everything, you're stuck, right?
Yeah, well,
and so again, this is all about planning, thinking, and thinking about this now when you have an ability to control it. Don't let it get out of hand. Start taking those steps today. Right?
Yeah, no, and no one likes to receive that bad news, but I think companies need to start hearing that.
Yep.
You know, that perhaps you're not doing things in the best way. You know, my best case is like pen testing companies.
Sure.
When they're having a good day,
Yep.
their customers having a terrible day.
Great.
Because they've hacked their environment, you
Yep.
know. And vice versa, if they're having a bad day, they're not doing their job
Yep.
correctly. So
Penetration testing.
yeah. So this is the important dynamic that goes on there. Now you can see that shift with DPOs. When DPOs unearth, well, you're not handling this information correctly.
Correct.
People are going to be embarrassed.
Yes.
You know, and that's going to be. But as you say, you can't influence. You can't fire them.
That's why be embarrassed now. Right?
Yeah, but it's not-
Fix it amongst yourself, right? Where they say, you know, don't air your dirty laundry out to the public,
Yeah,
right?
no.
I mean, if you have dirty laundry, fix it. You know, fix it before, because now is your chance and it's your opportunity, right? And you're only going to solidify your customer base and your customers' faith in your ability to protect data if you're diligent about it and you're thinking about it every day. And
Yeah.
let's say because when you choose a vendor, you're choosing a partner, right? And you want that partner to believe in it more than you do and to kind of drive you towards that data protection, like best practice, right?
Yeah.
That's who you want to choose. Like, don't choose the cheapest vendor. Don't choose, choose the best solution, but choose the solution that also believes in what they're doing, right? And acts like it too,
Yeah.
right? And so there are monumental benefits, I think, to a business that really embraces GDPR the right way and demonstrates that to their customers, because that, I think, is a critical reputation builder, is caring about this.
Yeah, no one wants to be that CEO on CNN saying, well, we got it wrong, do they? So rather get that out of the way now within your businesses, within your organisations,
Yeah.
you know, do that in-house.
We call those career-limiting events, right?
And we've seen a few of those.
Yes, we
Hence,
have.
you know, it's good to see GDPR.
Yeah.
So we know that sometimes some GDPR articles are open to some interpretation. So,
Sure.
for instance, I refer to Article 17, the right to be forgotten.
Okay.
So can we cover this Article 17 in the context of backup, archive,
basically
or...
it's a sort of a catch-22 situation.
Absolutely.
Because the GDPR states that you have to make sure that the data that you process is resilient. That means that if you lose the data, you're able to get it back in no time.
Yes, absolutely.
And for that, you need to have a backups in place or a backup system in place. And on the other side, or the other hand, you have the right to be forgotten.
Yes.
That's the paragraph you're referring to. So basically, it means that when someone says, I want to exercise my right to be forgotten, you have to take it out of the backups. And that's a bit tedious, because how are you going to do that in the end, you know? Because sometimes you use tapes, because then there's air between it, and you know, that's good. Or sometimes you use incremental backups, if you use a Veeam solution. So what happens if you have to follow up a request? And that's a sort of a catch-22 situation.
I would even double down on top of that it's even more of a catch-22 in that you also have to validate and certify that you did it, right? Mm-hmm. That means you have to keep a record of the fact that you deleted this person's information. But then if that person contacts you, right, you have to be able to validate it to say, I did it on X date. Well, how do you do that without keeping a record of the person's name and the contact information when it comes in, right? On top of that. So I think, GDPR is a really good initiative and first push out to, the greater mass.
Yeah, correct.
Like any legislation, it's not perfect when it's written. And it wasn't intended to be perfect. It was intended to be the best effort that we could do today. Just like GDPR requires of us to constantly evolve, I'm pretty sure GDPR will evolve itself as well. Absolutely. The kinks will start getting worked out. Certain areas will be focused on more, depending on what are the risks to personal data information. The first breach will tell us the first adjustment to GDPR too, right? and that, hey, we all need to do this better because this is what happened to everyone else. So this is a continuous improvement, constant learning type exercise. And you have to make calculated decisions in that which parts of the GDPR do you have to stress more importance, because you can't give it all equal importance, otherwise you run into conflict. So if the right to be forgotten, right? What I would say that what Veeam would do is that we would keep a list. We keep a list of all the people that wanted to be forgotten, and then we minimize their data from as many sources as possible to ensure that the possibility of it being restored into operation is minimal, right?
Yes.
As much to zero as possible. But at some point, my legally justified purpose of keeping at least one copy of that data is to validate that I did that, right? And so, yes, it's a little bit conflicting with what it says, right to be forgotten means erase me completely from the system. It doesn't really mean that, right? But so this is where you have to actually think about, how are you going to do this? What's the best way to do it? And for us, we're going to make a calculated decision to say we're going to keep a list. It's legally compliant, because it's a legally justified purpose to comply with GDPR, to say that these are the dates and these are the people that asked to be forgotten, and this is what we did, right? We can explain, document, and pinpoint to the date that we honored the request. We believe that that's more important than saying, I don't want any piece of this person's personal information in my ecosystem ever again, which is also quite impossible, right? Like you said, getting into backups, fine. If the backup is encrypted, you can't restore it. But then you have to think about on your restoration process of your backup. I think this is why you look at your process. When I restore, am I going to compare it to my list of individuals that shouldn't be restored to? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
That's the other purpose of having this list. Is so when you restore an instance to get back to functionality, at some point in your restoration process, you should scrub that database for the ability for the information being present in there. And one of the keys to what we design into our software at Veeam is that you can mark the location and you can add descriptions into your backups depending on where the machine was. And so we have warning signs too, that if you're backing up, let's say, a European-based data set into a US-based location, you will get a warning message that says, are you sure you want to do this? Because you're actually inadvertently moving data out of the EU into the US, right? And so we build different types of warning systems, into our panel, right? Our control access panel just to help you, give you that reminder. Are you sure you want to do this, right? And so part of your process of knowing your data is not just how you know it, manage it, how you protect it, how you back up, but then one step further, how do you restore, right? And what do you do when you restore? Yeah. Because your panic is always going to, and focus is going to be on, let's restore to availability and get to functionality of our business. And you forget, oh, there's this list of people that we shouldn't contact, right? And so maybe in your protocol of returning to operations, you might want to scrub that list before you launch your marketing campaign again, right? Scrub it against this list. So at Veeam, we're going to keep a list. If you want your data deleted, we're going to keep a list. We'll encrypt that file. And we'll only use it in restoration situations to ensure that we don't contact that person because they really didn't want to be contacted, right?
Perfect.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah.
But business process and thoughtful ideas is, I think, ultimately how you're going to handle these incongruent statements within the GDPR, and choose the one that is kind of most in line with the principles of GDPR, which is data protection. That's ultimately what we're trying to do, right? Achieve data protection.
Absolutely.
So organizations accelerate their digital transformation, and a lot of them embrace what we call a multi-cloud strategy. So any advice for those businesses who are highly cloud-consuming organizations? Leonard?
Yeah, what I would say if you use big cloud vendors is that you have to know the documentation that is underneath the surface, the surface that you're actually acquiring from those big vendors. You should not have the illusion that you're able to change the wording of contracts or data processing agreements. However, you should really know what they say about things and how they handle things, because only then you can make a calculated decision whether you would like to use that vendor or not. In my opinion, if you use a vendor which turns out to be not as strict with the GDPR as they should be, is that they will not go after you initially, unless you didn't do anything about GDPR, of course. But if you did everything you could do, and you have one vendor that didn't do his homework correctly, and it's a big vendor, I don't think the authorities will go to you first. They will also go to the big vendor to make sure that they change it for everyone, basically. So.
Especially because that impacts their customers, right?
Yeah.
That vendor's customers.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it walks back to a point that Christopher and I made before, which is you got to know your data, right? Every single service provider in the cloud or any other service provider that might process your data and becomes a data processor in your ecosystem is going to tell you it's your responsibility for giving me data that meets these certain requirements, right? And that's in that legal agreement, right? You can't just flip through it and say, hey, this is a big company, this is their legal agreement, I'm just going to sign it because I can't change the terms anyways. You actually need to understand your responsibilities. Yeah. When I hand that data over to Salesforce.com or Microsoft or Dynamics for my CRM, what confines do I have to be responsible for myself when I utilize their service, right? In order for us to cohesively meet the GDPR requirements, right? And this goes back to the partnership, right? Where Veeam can't be the only solution. The bunker can't be the only solution. Someone in the company needs to know and manage this data, that the bunker working with Veeam together is part of the solution, and that they work well together because their agreements say this, their companies do this, right? And all those checklists meet together when you choose your vendors. And so at Veeam, we choose our vendors very carefully. And we have been for the last 6 months evaluating every single contract and vendor that we use very carefully. We take the first look we look at is what's their privacy policy say? Is their privacy policy resembling a GDPR compliant privacy policy or not? Is that clause in there, the right to be forgotten, in there yet? If it's not, then it warrants a further question into that contract. And we won't rush to sign the contract because choosing our vendor is very, very important, right? Because who we use to process some piece of our operation ends up impacting the customer service that our customers end up receiving, right? Yeah. And so we, unfortunately in legal, we do hold our vendors to a much higher standard now since GDPR is coming. And there has to be a commitment that you need to get X, Y, and Z done. And me as the company choosing, the vendor, I have to know what I am asking for, right? Yeah. And so this is where the knowledge about GDPR in your ecosystem and your data comes into play. You need to know what you have, and then you need to know what you're using that vendor for so that you can ask them for it. And if they don't meet that criteria, this goes back to having executive management buy-in. Yeah. And that if your executive management or your CMO says, you know what, I need that vendor, right? And then, but we say that vendor is not even close to being GDPR compliant. Why would we take that risk? We need that vendor for whatever reason it may be, right? You need executive buy-in at your company, right? That this is a cohesive effort, a collaborative effort amongst all of us, that we do this together, right? And there are certain challenges and adjustments that we're going to have to make, including choosing a different vendor if they don't meet those requirements, because you as a company may say the penalty is too steep for me to take a risk just to honor that relationship, right? Yeah. And so evaluating your vendors is critically important.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think when we talk about cloud, it's not this mythical unicorn out there.
No. It's a rack somewhere, right?
It's a rack somewhere in the world. Right?
Oh, really?
Did you just define the cloud?
This is a news flash. But a lot of people need to understand where that rack is. Sure. Where is your data located? Because in GDPR, Chapter 5, Articles 44 to 50, those international transfers makes it quite difficult when you start going
offshore
with that data. So you've got to make sure, do you have binding corporate rules in place, etc.? Have you data sovereignty within the EU? If you've not, you've got to ask the question. If I'm working with a cloud provider, it's just as you said, I need to do my homework. It's down to me to understand what that processor is doing with that information, and do my due diligence. Again, Article 28, Paragraph 1 says, me as a controller, I must provide sufficient guarantees.
And document your diligence.
Absolutely right, absolutely right. So the processor now, I know you say they're not going to change their contracts, etc., but I'm seeing them changing privacy policies aligned with Articles 13 and 14 of the regulation, because they have to. They have to tell you who they are, who their data protection officer is, how they're processing their data, remind you of the rights, etc. So it needs to be clear to the data controller or data subject on where am I putting my information.
Absolutely.
We've seen a lot of SaaS-based sort of applications now, and they've still not done their homework here. You know, they're still not, and we're seeing quite a rush as we come towards that deadline. But yeah, I think they...
And be wary of those vendors that say we are GDPR compliant or we will be, right? And one of the simple tests that I do is to ask them quite simply, where are your data centers located, right? How are you really GDPR compliant or on your way if you don't have a single data center in the EU? Right,
yeah.
That's like we have to use common sense when you evaluate your vendors, right? You have to sniff out whether or not they're, just trying to sell you to keep you as a customer, or is there a legitimate risk there, right? If you ask your vendor, where are your data centers located, and they don't name a location that seems remotely compliant to the EU, which means within the EU or in the economic area, you need to ask more questions then, right? Because the scrutiny and the standards that you have to meet in order to transfer it offshore are much higher, right? And so now you have to ensure that data center, wherever they operate it, has all the same GDPR-like controls and regulations and access controls in place, right? In order to move your data, right? They're moving your data now as a controller into another country, right? And I think the other critical part is don't just say that you did it. You kind of have to document that you did it, right? Because ultimately, with a legislation as opposed to directive, is someone can come now check, and they can come ask you, hey, what did you do? And you can't say that we evaluated every single vendor. Great, prove it. Right?
Yeah, well, yeah.
How did you prove it?
Absolutely.
Right? Oh,
Absolutely.
I did it, trust me, right? That doesn't really work. So.
And I think a challenge for cloud vendors as well is breach sort of notification.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, so sort of sock and seam type of services out there where you know what's going on in those systems. Yep. The typical cloud at the moment, you're going to have to look at how you monitor any sort of security on a cloud, so you can notify your data subjects or your data processors in terms of, or controllers in terms of what's going on there. So I think that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and you piqued my interest in a topic that we talked about off air, which is encryption. Is encryption the one-all be-all solution to say that, hey, if I encrypt everything, I'm all set? The answer is no. Not even close, right? What encryption can help you do if you leverage it, which I would recommend for your most sensitive data and your critical data, which goes backwards to knowing what you're backing up and prioritizing your backups, right? So you prioritize certain sensitive information for that lengthier encryption time, right, that you need. Encryption can be the difference between the type of notice that you give if there's a breach, right? There was a breach, your data was encrypted, but it was not compromised. That's a much better message to send out there, to say your data was breached, it wasn't encrypted, and we're now, getting credit monitoring services for you or everything else, right, that comes along with that. And so you can't encrypt everything. That's not that's not business feasible, I would say, right? But that goes backwards to understanding where your data is, what your data is, and only protecting the most critical components, right? Because personal information, if it's managed properly and segregated properly, you can narrow down what your most sensitive backups should be, and you accept that business risk of it takes a little bit longer to recover. But I took that extra step to make sure that we protect our customers' information, right?
No,
so encryption is not the be-all, end-all magic silver bullet.
Yeah.
Just like there's no single solution out there that's going to solve all your GDPR problems. The only people that can is the people within the company that know how the company operates.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it is almost the end of the VeeamLive Show, unfortunately. Maybe one last question. What is the difference between GDPR and e-privacy?
Okay, so GDPR, we haven't got the new e-privacy sort of regulation yet, and that's doing its rounds.
Somewhere in the future, right, to be determined.
It would have been nice if it all came out at the same time. But so if you look at GDPR, it tackles non-automated and automated means of data security. So that means your paperwork and your sort of your technology, your systems. What it doesn't, and if you look at description of PII or personal data, it's an online identifier. So that puts cookies and so on and so forth into scope. we need help with that as kind of businesses in terms of those definitions, what you can do, what you can't do. So the e-privacy will help us, guide through those technical challenges. I can see there's going to be lots.
Yep.
I don't know about you guys, but things like how we, things like Skype or FaceTime, etc. That's all in scope. Unsolicited marketing, texts, mails. You're going to need those permissions, etc. So we're going to look for technology to help us there. So I think e-privacy will kind of set out the foundations for us as sort of business leaders to then be able to come up with those strategies and those sort of...
Yeah, and I argue that's also a little bit more, like you said, it's more complex and it's more in-depth. And it has a much bigger impact, not just on businesses, but on certain markets, right? Advertising markets that they do the tag-on video before you watch YouTube, right? The video before the video advertisement, right? The commercial before the commercial now, right? It impacts, I think, some businesses' actual core business too. And so I think that they're carefully thinking about those details. And the rollout's going to have a big impact, right? Because banner ads now, like that scroll through on your Skype right now, that you see them and you kind of ignore them, or maybe you click on them. Someone must be clicking on them, right? Because they still do it, right? So it must be effective. That's where I think e-privacy is going to start regulating and at least giving us, as companies, guidelines as to what you can and can't do, right? And I would expect there to be a rollout period for that too.
Yeah, and it's like, as we said, right to be forgotten. We need to sort of understand the do's and don'ts there. And it's sort of with GDPR, the systematic monitoring of behaviour. Well, cookies doing that, isn't it? So we need more guidance around this. So GDPR has made these statements, and I think e-privacy will help us, with our thinking, as we move forward.
And the interesting thing about it is that it's also a regulation this time, which means the same...
it will be a regulation.
Yeah, which means that it also...
Same force and effect.
It's immediately in effect in the member states when it's in effect. And it also gives the European Union the opportunity to fix their faulty cookie legislation, because what happened, of course, around and in the member states of the European Union is that every member state gave its own interpretation to the old cookie legislation. And that they're going to fix with this one. So at one point you will be not clicking banners or pop-ups anymore, because the vendors of browsers or devices have to make sure that by default, no third-party cookies are accepted anymore. So it gives us consumers also something positive when it comes to that.
But it gives the businesses a little more agitation in that websites that can't function with cookies completely disabled, right?
Yeah, and complete markets, affiliate marketing, for instance, depends heavily on cookies.
It's marketplaces again, exactly. And so it affects, I think, a larger ecosystem, which is why it's also taking a longer time, because some businesses...
It has impact, major impact.
Some businesses may be put out of business in general and legislated out, which is probably not what they intend to do, which is, one of those compelling forces driving them towards... how narrowed or how broad can they go, right? I think that's why it's still an organic kind of discussion right now as to how far can they go with that, right?
Absolutely.
So no panic with e-privacy, not yet.
Never
but
panic,
be prepared, step by step. GDPR first, and GDPR is a good start, very good start, even if you have to do it.
And I think, remember, with GDPR, a lot of the parts of GDPR that we're seeing today are just reinforced from the 95 directive, right?
Oh, yes.
Like I said, we have all been doing opt-in,
It's a codification of things we already knew.
Opt-in and opt-out has been around for a long time already, right? Just making sure that you stress test it is that one additional step that they want you to do. Make sure that it works, right? And so, I think step by step, we should be getting better as organizations, to protect this information.
Definitely.
So as I said, it's the end of the VeeamLive Show. So a last word or last advice for our audience to accelerate their GDPR effort. Chris, maybe you? Are you okay?
Well, so the journey is a long one, but to coin a phrase, you know, the 1,000-mile step begins with one step at a time. I think the important thing here is to start that process. You know, start looking at your data mapping. Yep. You know, it's a great place to start. What do you have within your business? What worries you? You know, you can run that up against the Article 5, the principles of GDPR. That will see where you're exposed. You may need a little bit of help in terms of consultancy to get your policies, processes and procedures right. I take on board what you said in terms of you know, promoting someone internally to look after that. You know, you don't have to do it alone. Maybe get a governance team around you to help you with systems, to help you with policies, to help you with the HR. You know, start to bring this together, because what we talked about is, you know, they're not going to penalise you come 25th of May. You know, it is a date where it's enforced. Okay,
Correct.
If you've done nothing, that's when, you know, that's when it will be tough for you as a business. If you've at least started, you know, working with your vendors, looking at your contracts, looking at the data you have, I think that will certainly start accelerating you as a business and getting you on that path to compliance.
I agree.
Excellent.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. The thing is, I say just start. Don't put it off. Don't wait for trade organizations or associations to say something about this or that. Just start yourself, look at yourself. Don't be embarrassed about it. We talked about the embarrassing part a lot, but don't be embarrassed. You're not alone. A lot of companies will come to the conclusion that they don't have things in place or don't do things correctly. And also know, and this is why I say just start, that it will never be ended. You will always be busy with the GDPR. New interpretations come. Authorities will come up with new paperwork. You know, you will always be busy with that. So if you start now, you're doing fine.
Thank you, Lena.
And I concur. And you know what Veeam has done, and you know, we joined forces, you know, internally to develop a white paper that talked about the 5 lessons that we learned. Which we've kind of already touched upon, but it's about knowing your data, managing your data, protecting your data, documenting, right? And the final part is continuous improvement. We have white papers. We've actually put the surveys out that we used at Veeam to initiate our compliance policy on available to our partners that register for it. So we have white papers, resources, executive blogs that talk about Veeam's journey and how does Veeam as a data protection solution provider think about data privacy and GDPR, right? We won't tell you that we can solve your problem for you. We can't. We're part of the solution, but we'll tell you how we did it, right? And we'll even give you the tools of how we did it, right? And this is from the support of our shareholders and founders of the company that said, let's get this information out to our customers and partners so they can learn how Veeam did it and make life a little bit easier for them. So the white paper's out there. The surveys that we actually use for each organization is out there as well, available for download. And I would say just start there. Start reading, start learning about it, and start trying to fill out that survey. The surveys are designed to basically ask your employees in HR, marketing, and sales, how do you touch data? What do you do with it? How do you use it? How are you transferring it? And documenting it at all multiple levels of the organization. Start there to know your data, right? Then manage your data, protect your data, document, and then continuous improvement. And you'll find that it's pretty much downhill in more like the downhill part of a run after you get through that initial phase, right? That initial phase will be 1 or 2 surveys deep. You're going to open that survey up and you'll say, well, is that really right? And what's valuable is you send that to a different part of the organization in the same group and say, is this how you guys do it as well? They'll say, we'll do something a little different in this country, right? But here's the valuable part about this process. You now have a map of how your company does things, right? And that's what you need as your ground-based foundation to take that next step, to understand now how do we optimize it, right? How do we choose the right vendors? How do we manage it? Then ultimately, what do we protect? How do we protect it? Encrypt or not encrypt, right? And then you keep thinking about this, right? And so we at Veeam, we still have a weekly update, you know, amongst the team members that talk about, Mark, we came up with this in this region. I think we need to adjust this. So it's constant discussion, constant improvement. And so start with our white paper, start with our surveys, you know, and then once you get digging in, you'll find that we're going to walk you through it. We're not going to say that this is how you do it, or just buy Veeam and it's going to take care of all your problems. It won't, but we'll walk you along the way we did it.
It is on our website.
It is on our website, yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
GDPR deadline is approaching, and we are firmly into the transition period. You should not panic, as we said all, but prioritize and see the GDPR as an opportunity. Data privacy and protection are responsibilities that will only increase as the digital world we live in continues to evolve and expand at a rapid pace. You heard today key principles learned by your companies on a way to be GDPR compliant. You remark that it also requires constant monitoring, auditing, review, and improvement. We think in Veeam that the only way to do this is to leverage software solutions that are constantly innovating and backup solutions that are state-of-the-art today, where the company is consistently reinvesting in continuous development to conquer the challenges of tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.